The white silk sheets of our honeymoon bed were still warm when the first reinforced window shattered. For barely 48 hours, I had been the official wife of Seoul's deadliest underworld king, and his enemies had already come to collect my head. I thought marrying Jung-Ho meant the war was over. I didn't realize that wearing his ring simply meant I had to learn how to fight beside the devil instead of running from him. Welcome back to part 2 of Nia's romance collection. The wedding bells are ringing, but in the underworld, they sound a lot like a declaration of war. If you love fiercely possessive husbands, spicy romance, and heroines who refuse to be damsels in distress, hit that subscribe button. The honeymoon is over. Let's dive in. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. Not a single elder dared to speak, let alone object, as the shredded remnants of the marriage contracts settled onto the polished floor. Madame Yoon's face was a mask of cold, vibrating fury, but Jung-Ho didn't spare his mother a second glance. His hand was an unbreakable grip on my waist, his broad frame a physical barricade against the venom in the room. He turned, pulling me against his side, and guided me out the heavy double doors. The second the locks clicked shut behind us, the oppressive tension of the council shattered. But the danger didn't fade. He didn't speak. His long strides ate up the corridor until he shoved open a hidden door, dragging us into a private, soundproof office. The heavy thud of the door sealing us in finally broke the spell. The adrenaline evaporated from my veins, leaving me hollow and shaking. I swayed, but Jung-Ho was already there. His massive hands caught me under the arms, hauling my trembling body against his chest. The familiar, dark scent of smoked cedar and rain rushed into my lungs as I buried my face into his tailored overcoat. "Breathe, Mila," he murmured, the deep rumble of his voice vibrating directly against my ear. His fingers tangled in the loose curls at the nape of my neck, holding me steady. "They are gone. You are safe." "I just blew up your entire world," I choked out, my fingers curling tightly into the expensive wool of his lapels. "Your mother, the Choi family, they are going to declare war on you because of me." "Let them," he replied, the lethal calm in his tone terrifying in its certainty. He pulled back just enough to frame my face, his thumbs gently wiping away a stray tear. His dark eyes were feral, burning with a possessive heat that consumed the remaining oxygen in the room. "I told you, I would burn them all to ash before I let them touch you. But the rules have changed." He stepped back, keeping one hand firmly anchored on my hip. "You cannot go back to that cramped apartment," he stated, the ruthless syndicate king bleeding back into his features. "The hospital is compromised. Your old life is gone, Mila. From this second forward, you do not walk out of a room alone. You do not drive yourself. You belong to my world now." A sudden, sharp spike of fear tightened my chest. But before I could protest, the office door opened. A towering man in a sleek, dark suit stepped in, bowing low to Jung-Ho, before turning his stoic, highly trained gaze to me. "This is Tae-jin," Jung-Ho announced, his eyes never leaving mine. "He answers only to me, and he will die before he lets a single threat within 10 feet of you." The fluorescent lights of the emergency room used to feel like a sanctuary. Today, they just felt blinding. I walked through the automatic double doors for the last time, not in my familiar blue scrubs, but in a tailored beige trench coat Jung-Ho had draped over my shoulders before I left the estate. I wasn't alone. Tae-jin walked half a step behind me,
his massive frame cutting through the chaotic triage ward like a shark gliding through shallow water. A second guard flanked my right side, radiating a quiet, deadly efficiency.
The frantic energy of the hospital immediately flatlined. Nurses who had gossiped about me just days ago completely froze, their eyes wide as they took in the terrifying security detail surrounding me. Dr. Hayes dropped a clipboard, the plastic clattering loudly against the linoleum. He didn't say a single word. No one did. The untouchable aura of the syndicate had wrapped itself around me, entirely severing my ties to this ordinary world. Emptying my metal locker took less than 5 minutes. I tossed my stethoscope and worn-out sneakers into a small cardboard box, a quiet ache settling deep in my chest. My independent, structured life was officially over. I handed my printed resignation to the terrified shift supervisor, who took the paper with trembling hands, clearly desperate for me to leave her floor. Taejin seamlessly cleared a path for my exit. The heavy glass doors parted, the cold afternoon wind biting at my cheeks as we stepped out toward the waiting town car. "Leaving so soon?" The voice was melodic, razor sharp, and completely coated in ice. I stopped on the pavement. Standing near the edge of the parking lot, flanked by her own imposing security men, was a woman who looked like she had just stepped off a high-fashion runway. She was impossibly beautiful, wearing a flawless crimson designer coat, her dark hair sleek and perfectly straight. Taejin instantly shifted, placing his broad body partially in front of mine, his hand resting near the inside of his suit jacket. The woman didn't flinch at his subtle, violent warning. She took a slow, calculated step forward, her piercing, dark eyes locked directly onto mine with absolute, unfiltered hatred. "You must be the hospital worker who destroyed my marriage contracts," she said, her lips curving into a cruel, perfect smile. Jia, the Choi heiress. A cold spike of genuine dread pierced my ribs. This wasn't Jung-Ho's mother trying to bribe me with a polite envelope of cash. This was the woman whose entire future I had publicly stolen. "Enjoy his estate while you can," Jia whispered, her voice dropping to a chilling frequency that easily carried over the freezing wind. My family built this city alongside his. We do not accept broken promises, and we certainly do not let commoners wear our crowns. I am going to take back exactly what belongs to me. She didn't wait for my response. She turned gracefully, sliding into the back of her waiting silver sedan, leaving a promise of absolute war lingering in the freezing air. The heavy doors of the private library sealed shut behind me, completely cutting off the sounds of the sprawling estate. The room smelled of aged paper and the familiar, lingering warmth of smoked cedar. But the sanctuary did nothing to melt the ice in my veins. Jia's voice still echoed in my ears, a cruel and perfect promise of war. I wrapped my arms tightly around my chest, staring blindly into the flickering flames of the massive stone fireplace. "Who looked at you?" The voice came from the shadows, low and vibrating with immediate, lethal focus. Jung-Ho stepped into the warm glow of the fire, having discarded his tailored overcoat. He wore a simple black turtleneck that clung to the hard lines of his broad shoulders. His dark eyes scanned my rigid posture with terrifying precision. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, stopping inches away. He didn't ask if I was okay. In his world, fear was the symptom of a breached perimeter. "Tell me what happened," he commanded softly, his large hands reaching out to gently pry my arms apart before settling heavily on my waist. "Jia was waiting outside the hospital," I whispered, unable to hide the tremor in my voice as I looked up into his sharp, aristocratic features. "She didn't just threaten me, Jung-Ho. She looked at me like I was a temporary obstacle, like she could erase me and simply take back her future with your family." The air in the library completely stopped moving. The muscles in Jung-Ho's jaw locked into a severe, terrifying line. He didn't explode in anger. Instead, a chilling, absolute certainty settled over his dark eyes. "She is a fool holding on to a dead alliance," he murmured, his thumbs slowly smoothing over the fabric of my sweater. "But guards and fortified walls are no longer enough. I will not let you live in the shadow of my family's broken contracts. I need the entire underworld to understand exactly who you are to me." Before I could ask what he meant, the King of Souls' deadliest syndicate released my waist and took a deliberate step back. He dropped to one knee. All the oxygen rushed out of the room. I stared down at him, completely paralyzed. From his pocket, he pulled a small, dark velvet box and flicked it open. Resting inside was a massive, flawless emerald-cut diamond that caught the firelight with blinding brilliance. He reached for my left hand. His warm, calloused fingers were perfectly steady as he slid the heavy, freezing stone onto my ring finger. It was an exact fit, a permanent, undeniable claim. He looked up at me, the dangerous predator completely vanishing, leaving only a man staring at his absolute center of gravity. "You are not a temporary obstacle, Mila," he vowed, his deep voice thick with unwavering devotion. "You are my future. We marry by the end of the week." The cliffside chapel wasn't built for celebration. It was built for absolute secrecy. There were no reporters, no lavish floral arrangements, and no soft music playing in the background. Instead, the perimeter was locked down by dozens of elite guards holding automatic weapons, their dark suits blending into the stormy evening shadows. I stood in the heavy oak doorway, the cold stone floor radiating a chill that seeped right through the hem of my gown. The dress was a masterpiece of heavy ivory silk and delicate lace, tailored in less than 3 days, trailing behind me like a pool of liquid pearl. I gripped the small bouquet of white orchids so tightly my fingers ached. This wasn't the wedding I had dreamed of as a little girl. It was a syndicate claiming. I stepped into the dimly lit aisle. The scent of melting beeswax candles and old stone filled my lungs. The pews were mostly empty, save for a few of the highest-ranking elders, their eyes tracking my every step with silent, heavy assessment. And then there was Madame Yoon. She sat rigid in the front row, wearing a flawless charcoal coat. She didn't glare or sneer. Her expression was completely unreadable, a mask of icy, terrifying calculation, as she watched the hospital worker she had tried to bribe walk toward her only son. I kept my chin high, forcing myself to hold her gaze for a fraction of a second to prove I wasn't running, before shifting my focus to the altar. Because waiting for me was Jung-Ho. He wore a sharply tailored, pitch-black tuxedo that emphasized the massive, dangerous lines of his shoulders. The terrifying syndicate king, who had just shredded his family's alliances, stood perfectly still. When his dark, intense eyes finally locked onto mine, the cold chapel, the elders, and his terrifying mother simply ceased to exist. There was no hesitation in his posture. As I took my final step, he reached out, closing his large, warm hands over my trembling fingers. The sheer heat radiating from his skin anchored me instantly, chasing away the chill of the stone room. "You look breathtaking," he murmured, his deep, gravelly voice meant only for me, completely ignoring the dangerous world watching our every move. His thumbs slowly brushed over my knuckles, a quiet, fiercely possessive touch that promised absolute protection. The officiant's words echoed off the ancient stone walls, but the traditional ceremony faded into meaningless background noise. I could only focus on the massive, untouchable man holding my hands. The heavy silver rings were presented, But Jung-Ho didn't recite the standard vows. He stepped closer, eliminating the last fraction of space between us, forcing me to tilt my head back to meet his intense, ink-black gaze. "They expect me to promise to cherish you," Jung-Ho murmured, his deep, gravelly voice carrying a lethal weight that commanded the absolute silence of every syndicate elder in the pews. "But cherish is a word for fragile things." He slid the heavy, diamond-encrusted band onto my left finger. His warm, calloused thumb dragged over my knuckles, pressing a silent brand into my skin. "I do not cherish you, Mila. I claim you." His words were a hushed, savage vow meant only for me, yet they resonated with the terrifying authority of a king cementing his reign. "My empire, my bloodline, and every breath I have left belong entirely to you. Anyone who dares to look at you will have to answer to my wrath. You are my queen, and I am yours until the earth takes me." The raw, unapologetic devotion in his voice washed away the last of my fears. The intimidating guards, the icy glare of his mother, the threats of rival families, they all dissolved into ash. I took the solid platinum band from the velvet cushion. My hands were perfectly steady as I slid it over his scarred knuckle. "And I claim you," I whispered back, my voice unwavering in the quiet chapel, in the dark and in the light. A dangerous, consuming heat flared in his eyes. He didn't wait for the officiant's permission. His large hands framed my face, his long fingers sliding into my hair, pulling at the pins of my updo without a single care. He pulled me flush against his chest, the hard lines of his tuxedo pressing into the heavy silk of my gown, and crashed his mouth down on mine. It wasn't a sweet, polite wedding kiss. It was a desperate, bruising possession. His lips took mine with a starving intensity, sealing the vow and putting the entire underworld on notice. A sudden, blinding flash from the syndicate's private photographer illuminated the dark chapel, capturing the exact second the King of Soul fully surrendered his soul. When he finally pulled back, his chest heaving, his forehead rested against mine. He looked down at me, a fiercely proud, devastating smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. The war for his ring was over. The deafening roar of the private jet turbines finally died, replaced by the rhythmic crashing of ocean waves against a hidden shoreline. I stepped onto the tarmac, the heavy ivory silk of my wedding gown dragging slightly against the warm concrete. The freezing wind of Seoul was completely gone, replaced by the thick, tropical midnight air of a secluded, private island. Jung-Ho stood at the base of the metal stairs, waiting for me. He had discarded his tuxedo jacket and bow tie somewhere over the Pacific, his crisp white dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar, the cuffs rolled back to expose his heavily scarred forearms. The moonlight cast sharp, dramatic shadows across his aristocratic features. We didn't take a car. The sprawling, ultra-modern glass estate sat just beyond a line of exotic trees, glowing like a solitary lantern against the pitch-black jungle. As we walked up the stone pathway, the dozens of elite guards who had flown with us seamlessly melted into the tree line, fanning out to secure the perimeter. Tae-jin gave a single, rigid bow before turning his back on the main house, disappearing into the dark. For the first time since the night I pulled a bleeding stranger into my cramped apartment, we were completely alone. Jung-Ho pushed open the massive double doors, guiding me into a cavernous foyer. The silence inside the estate was absolute. There were no maids, no elders, no buzzing security radios. The sudden isolation stripped away the chaotic armor of the underworld, leaving behind a raw, overwhelming intimacy that made the air feel entirely too thick to breathe. He didn't turn on the main lights. The house was illuminated only by the silver moonlight spilling through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He locked the door behind us, the heavy metallic click echoing with finality through the empty space. When he turned back to me, the terrifying syndicate king was gone. His dark eyes slowly mapped my face, dragging down the length of my intricate lace gown before locking onto mine again. The distance between us hummed with a heavy, electric gravity. Every breath I took felt incredibly loud in the quiet room. He closed the space between us with agonizing slowness, his large hands reaching out to gently cup my shoulders. The sheer heat of his palms seeped through the delicate lace, anchoring my trembling frame. "No one can reach us here," Jung-Ho murmured, his deep, gravelly voice washing over my skin like a physical touch. He stepped flush against me, his chest brushing the silk of my dress, his thumb slowly tracing the line of my collarbone. "The war stays on the mainland, Mila. Tonight, there is only you and me." He didn't carry me over the threshold of the master suite. He simply laced his fingers through mine, guiding me into a room entirely bathed in silver moonlight. The massive balcony doors were wide open, allowing the thick, tropical night air to mingle with the lingering, intoxicating scent of his smoked cedar cologne. He stopped me near the edge of the sprawling bed, gently turning me around so my back was pressed flush against the solid wall of his chest. I looked into the floor-to-ceiling mirror across the room, watching the terrifying, untouchable king of the underworld lower his head to the curve of my neck. His large, calloused hands moved to the delicate row of pearl buttons trailing down my spine. The contrast was breathtaking. The violent, faded silver scars marking his knuckles, moving with agonizing, worshipful care against my warm, brown skin. With every button he released, a heavy, trembling heat built steadily in my center. He parted the lace, pressing soft, lingering kisses to the newly exposed skin of my shoulders. Low, ragged Korean syllables vibrated against my collarbone. I didn't need to speak the language to understand the starving reverence in his tone. He wasn't just undressing me. He was carefully taking down every defensive wall I had ever built. The heavy ivory silk finally slipped past my hips, pooling in a shimmering puddle at my feet. I stood before him, my breathing shallow and erratic in the quiet room. Jung-Ho stepped around the discarded gown, placing himself directly in front of me. His dark eyes drank me in, feral, fiercely protective, and utterly captivated. He raised his hands, gently framing my jaw, his thumbs tracing the line of my cheekbones. "My wife," he breathed, the English words carrying a devastating, absolute finality. I tangled my fingers in his thick, dark hair, pulling him down to meet me. The kiss was a consuming fire, entirely erasing the terrified hospital nurse who had tried to reject him weeks ago. His arms banded around my waist, lifting me effortlessly off the floor as he carried me toward the white silk sheets, ready to prove exactly what it meant to be fully and permanently claimed by him. The brilliant morning sun spilling across the mattress woke me long before the island birds began to sing. I blinked against the light, my body completely wrapped in the heavy warmth of the man sleeping beside me. We were tangled in white silk, isolated from the violent reality of Seoul by thousands of miles of ocean. I slowly turned my head, careful not to disturb his resting arm banded securely across my waist. In the bright daylight, Jung-Ho was breathtaking. The lethal, calculated tension that usually gripped his broad shoulders had entirely melted away. His dark, thick hair fell haphazardly across his forehead, softening the sharp, aristocratic lines of his jaw. For the very first time since I dragged him out of that freezing alley, he didn't look like a syndicate king guarding his throne. He simply looked like a husband. I gently traced the faded silver scars across his chest with the pad of my index finger, fascinated by the map of survival inked into his skin. His breathing hitched. Before I could pull my hand away, his long fingers captured my wrist. He didn't open his eyes immediately. A deep, sleep-rough hum vibrated in his chest as he dragged my hand upward, pressing his warm lips against my palm. "You are staring, my queen," he murmured, his gravelly voice thick with sleep. He finally opened his eyes. The dark depths that usually radiated dangerous authority were completely unguarded, swimming with a heavy, lazy devotion. "I am just making sure you are real," I whispered, shifting closer until my knee brushed his. "Sometimes I feel like I'm going to wake up in my cramped apartment, and all of this will just be a wild dream." Jung-Ho shifted, rolling onto his side to face me fully. The movement brought the heavy platinum band on his finger into the sunlight, catching the glare. He reached out, brushing a loose curl from my cheek before letting his hand rest at the nape of my neck. "If this were a dream, I would never let you wake up," he stated softly. He pulled me flush against his hard chest, burying his face in the crook of my neck. The comforting scent of smoked cedar and warm skin enveloped my senses, anchoring me to the present. There were no elders demanding obedience. There was no rival heiress plotting our ruin. There was only the rhythmic sound of the waves crashing against the private shoreline and the steady, calming beat of his heart. I closed my eyes, letting the absolute peace of the island wash over me. In his arms, the world outside this room simply ceased to exist. I had no idea how fragile our paradise truly was. The island night was usually a symphony of crashing waves and rustling palm leaves. I lay awake, tracing the strong, rhythmic rise and fall of Jung-Ho's bare chest, completely lulled by the absolute safety of his arms. The digital clock on the mahogany nightstand read 2 a.m. Then, the low hum of the central air conditioning died. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful, it was a vacuum. The soft, ambient lighting lining the hallway corridors completely vanished, plunging the massive glass estate into total, suffocating darkness. Jung-Ho didn't wake up slowly. The shift from deep sleep to lethal alertness happened in a fraction of a second. The heavy arm draped over my waist instantly tightened, his entire muscular frame coiling with the terrifying tension of a predator sensing a threat. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice a harsh, low whisper that carried zero trace of the affectionate husband from hours ago. Before I could ask what was wrong, the deafening sound of high-caliber automatic gunfire shredded the quiet night. The reinforced floor-to-ceiling window across the bedroom exploded inward. A shower of jagged glass rained over the dark carpet. They hadn't come through the jungle. The Choi mercenaries had bypassed the perimeter guards by launching an assault directly from the sea. I gasped, instinctively curling inward, but Jung-Ho was already moving. He threw his massive body entirely over mine, shielding my skin from the deadly spray of debris. He rolled off the mattress with terrifying, fluid speed. In the pitch black, his hand found a hidden biometric panel beneath the nightstand. A heavy metallic click echoed through the room, and he pulled a matte black tactical weapon from the concealed wall safe. The ruthless syndicate king had fully returned. "Jung-Ho," I whispered, fear rising hot and fast in my throat as heavily armed shadows moved violently outside the ruined window frame. "Do not move from this spot," he ordered, racking the slide of the weapon with a sharp, mechanical clack. His dark eyes locked onto mine in the shadows, feral and burning with absolute, unrestrained violence. "I will not let them take you." He didn't wait for my response. He turned his broad, scarred back to me and stalked directly into the chaos, his weapon raised, ready to slaughter anyone who dared to set foot inside our sanctuary. We didn't stay in the bedroom. Staying stationary in a glass house during an assault was a guaranteed death sentence. Jung-Ho gripped my hand, his palm rough and steady, pulling me low as we navigated the pitch-black corridors of the estate. The deafening crack of gunfire echoed from the lower levels, blending with the aggressive shouting of the Choi mercenaries breaching the terrace. Taejin materialized from the shadows near the grand staircase, his tactical rifle raised. He didn't speak, exchanging a single sharp nod with my husband before taking the lead. We moved in a tight, rapid formation toward the reinforced eastern wing. Then, the hallway completely erupted. Rapid muzzle flashes illuminated the dark plaster as 3 armed men rounded the corner. Jung-Ho shoved me behind a heavy marble pillar, stepping into the open to return fire with terrifying, mechanical precision. The exchange lasted less than 5 seconds, but the damage was immediate. A sharp, wet thud echoed over the ringing in my ears. Taejin collapsed against the wall, sliding heavily to the hardwood floor. A dark, rapidly expanding pool of crimson soaked through the shoulder of his tactical vest, just below his collarbone. Subclavian artery. "Taejin!" Jung-Ho commanded, his voice tight as he kept his weapon raised, scanning the dark corridor to ensure the threat was neutralized. The massive guard tried to lift his rifle, his breathing ragged, but his muscles failed. In the underworld, a fallen soldier was a casualty left behind. But I wasn't from the underworld. The sheer terror that had paralyzed me moments ago vanished, instantly replaced by the cold, clinical focus of an ER trauma nurse. I didn't scream, and I didn't freeze. I dropped to my knees on the hardwood floor, crawling out from behind the pillar to reach him. "Mila, stay back!" Jung-Ho barked, the first sound of genuine panic fracturing his lethal composure. I completely ignored him. I grabbed the edge of my white silk nightgown, tearing a long, thick strip of the heavy fabric without a single hesitation. I pressed my bare hands directly into the pooling blood, locating the exact source of the arterial bleed. "Keep your chin up," I ordered Taejin, my voice ringing with an absolute, practiced authority that startled the bleeding guard. I didn't wait for his compliance. I aggressively packed the torn silk deep into the wound, forcing the fabric against the severed vessel to stop the massive hemorrhaging. Taejin let out a strained, muffled groan, his stoic expression cracking in pain. I leaned my entire body weight onto my palms, locking my elbows to maintain the crushing pressure required to keep him alive. Jung-Ho slowly lowered his weapon. When he looked down, expecting to see a terrified, weeping bride, he saw something entirely different. He saw a woman covered in blood, breathing steadily, holding his elite guard back from the edge of death. His wild gaze locked onto mine, the alarm in his dark eyes instantly shifting into a profound, fiercely proud realization. I wasn't a liability. I was exactly where I belonged. 2 of the remaining perimeter guards materialized from the stairwell, moving fast. Jung-Ho gave a sharp, silent command, and they hoisted Taejin by his tactical vest, carrying him toward the medical wing. I wiped my blood-stained hands on the remnants of my torn silk nightgown, my breathing completely steady. Jung-Ho didn't waste a single second. He grabbed my forearm, pulling me down a narrow, hidden corridor behind the library. We reached a solid steel door seamlessly built into the stone wall. He pressed his palm against the biometric scanner, and the heavy metal hissed open, revealing a stark, windowless panic room lined with glowing security monitors. He ushered me inside, his eyes immediately darting to the screens. The perimeter cameras displayed a chaotic war zone, but one specific feed made his broad shoulders stiffen into absolute stone. I followed his gaze. Standing near the ruined front gates, flanked by heavily armed mercenaries, was an older man in a tailored suit, directing the assault with cold precision. "Chairman Choi," Jung-Ho murmured, the name dripping with lethal venom. The patriarch of the Choi family hadn't just sent foot soldiers to avenge his daughter's broken engagement. He had come to ensure the execution himself.
Jung-Ho turned away from the monitors. He walked over to a steel lockbox mounted on the wall, entered a rapid code, and pulled out a compact matte black handgun. He turned back to me, taking my trembling, blood-stained hands in his. He pressed the cold metal of the weapon directly into my palms. You saved my life with a needle. And you just saved my guard with a piece of silk, he said, his gravelly voice dropping to a fierce, commanding whisper. But right now, I need you to hold this. I gripped the heavy weapon, looking up into his sharp, aristocratic face. The soft,
Devoted husband who had kissed me in the morning sunlight was completely buried. Standing before me was the apex predator of Seoul's underworld, vibrating with a terrifying, ancient violence. I am not going to let them hunt you in our home, he stated, his dark eyes burning with unwavering certainty. Stay away from this door. Do not respond to any voice other than mine. If anyone else manages to breach that threshold, you aim for their chest and you do not hesitate. Jung-Ho, I breathed, my fingers tightening around the grip of the gun as he took a deliberate step backward. Come back to me. A devastating, arrogant smirk flickered across his lips, completely devoid of fear. I am the king of this syndicate, Mila, and the Choi family is about to learn exactly why. He stepped out of the bunker. The heavy steel door slid shut, the locking mechanism echoing with a loud, final click, leaving me entirely alone in the cold glow of the security monitors. The heavy steel door sealed me in complete silence, leaving only the soft hum of the ventilation system and the pale blue glow of the security monitors. I stepped closer to the bank of screens, my blood-stained hands gripping the cold edge of the metal console. The estate was a sprawling grid of black and white night vision. I tracked the feed from the grand foyer, where 5 of Chairman Choi's mercenaries were fanning out, their heavy boots stepping over the shattered glass of our home. They moved with strict military precision, sweeping their rifles toward the shadowed archways. They didn't stand a chance. Jung-Ho didn't engage them in a standard firefight. He hunted them. I watched, completely mesmerized, as the man who had held me so gently in the morning sunlight blended entirely into the dark corners of his own house. He was shirtless, a massive, lethal shadow armed with a tactical weapon and an ancient, terrifying instinct for violence. On the third screen, a mercenary separated from the group, stepping cautiously into the hallway outside the library. Jung-Ho descended from the darkness of the upper landing without making a single sound. He didn't waste a bullet. With a fluid, brutal motion, he disarmed the man from behind, neutralizing the threat before the mercenary could even register a presence. It was terrifyingly fast, a masterclass in silent, clinical eradication. I couldn't look away. I moved my eyes to the next camera feed. 3 more armed men breached the eastern terrace. Jung-Ho was already waiting in the blind spot of the massive stone pillars. He stepped out, raising his weapon with a cold, mechanical calm. The muzzle flashed on the monitor in brilliant white bursts. He moved with impossible speed, advancing over the fallen bodies without a second glance, his posture radiating a pure, focused wrath. This was the king of the syndicate. This was the monster the underworld whispered about in hushed, terrified tones. Watching him dismantle an elite assault team should have sent me spiraling into panic. He was ruthlessly ending human lives on the very floors we had walked across hours ago. But as I stood in the cold bunker, clutching the gun he had pressed into my hands, I didn't feel a single drop of fear toward him. Every calculated strike, every bullet fired, was a defensive wall he was building to keep me safe. He was tearing down his enemies to ensure they never reached this steel door. The camera feed switched to the grand courtyard. Jung-Ho stepped out into the tropical night, a sudden downpour beginning to wash over his scarred shoulders. He stood completely alone, surrounded by the wreckage of the Choi assault team, waiting for the final confrontation. He didn't look exhausted. He looked invincible. And as Chairman Choi finally stepped into the frame, escorted by his last two guards, Jung-Ho slowly raised his weapon. The rain on the monitor distorted the sharp lines of Chairman Choi's tailored suit. He stood in the center of the courtyard, surrounded by the fallen bodies of his elite strike team, staring down the barrel of my husband's weapon. He didn't look terrified. He looked like a man who believed he still held the winning hand. Choi slowly reached into his soaked jacket, pulling out a heavy satellite phone. He was calling his reserves. He had an entire fleet waiting just beyond the island's reef, heavily armed and ready to sweep the estate. "You are a skilled fighter, Jung-Ho," Choi's voice crackled through the bunker's audio feed, laced with arrogant certainty. "But you are only one man. When my boats hit the shore, your reign ends." Choi pressed the call button. Before the signal could even connect, a blinding flash of orange and red illuminated the pitch-black horizon behind him. A fraction of a second later, the deep, heavy shockwave of a massive explosion vibrated through the solid steel floor beneath my feet. The Choi reinforcement boats didn't just sink. They were completely incinerated. Chairman Choi froze, the satellite phone hovering near his ear. His arrogant composure shattered into genuine, raw panic. He spun around, staring at the burning wreckage lighting up the dark ocean. Then, the phone in his hand began to ring. Choi answered, his hand trembling slightly. The audio feed in my bunker picked up the incoming voice perfectly. It wasn't one of his commanders. It was a woman. "You dared to send mercenaries into my son's home?" Madame Yoon spoke, her flawless, aristocratic English dripping with an icy, terrifying venom that commanded absolute silence. Choi's face drained of all color. "Madame Yoon," he stammered, the powerful patriarch of a rival syndicate suddenly sounding like a cornered subordinate. "By the time this call ends, the Choi family will cease to exist." Her voice echoed smoothly through the speaker. "I have already seized your shipping ports. Your accounts are entirely liquidated. Your daughter has been detained by my security team in Seoul, and your escape route is currently burning in the Pacific." She didn't intervene to save my life. She intervened because the Choi family had made the fatal mistake of threatening the absolute center of her empire. "You are finished," she stated, a lethal, undeniable fact. The line went dead. Choi let the phone slip from his fingers, the heavy plastic clattering against the wet stone. He turned back, slowly, stripped of his wealth, his army, and his future, finally looking at the king of the underworld, who was waiting for him in the pouring rain. The burning wreckage off the coast cast long, dancing shadows across the flooded courtyard. Chairman Choi stood completely paralyzed, the phone slipping from his limp fingers. He didn't try to run or beg. The sudden, absolute destruction of his entire empire had broken his mind before Jung-Ho even pulled the trigger. Jung-Ho closed the final few yards between them, the heavy rain washing over his scarred shoulders. He didn't yell. He didn't offer a dramatic monologue or a final insult. In his world, words were reserved for negotiations, and this was an execution. Choi sank to his knees in the pooling rainwater, entirely defeated. Jung-Ho raised his weapon with a cold, mechanical calm. The muzzle flashed on the monitor in one brilliant, final burst, and the patriarch of the Choi family collapsed onto the wet stone. The threat was permanently erased. The war was officially over. I exhaled a ragged breath, setting the compact handgun onto the steel console. The adrenaline that had kept my hands perfectly steady for the past hour finally began to recede, leaving my muscles weak and trembling. I leaned heavily against the metal desk, the silence of the bunker suddenly feeling vast and overwhelming. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then, the biometric scanner outside the panic room chimed softly. The heavy steel door hissed open. Jung-Ho stepped into the pale blue light of the bunker. He was completely drenched, his bare chest slick with rainwater, ash, and the remnants of the battle. He looked like a dark, ancient god of war, returning from a slaughter. But the moment his intense, dark eyes found me standing by the monitors, the lethal predator vanished entirely. The tactical weapon slipped from his grip, clattering loudly against the steel floor. He crossed the small room in 2 massive strides and dropped straight to his knees in front of me. His large, calloused hands wrapped around my waist, pulling my hips flush against his chest as he buried his face into the torn, blood-stained silk of my nightgown. His broad shoulders heaved with a ragged, exhausted breath, his massive frame trembling slightly against mine. I immediately sank to the floor with him, entirely uncaring about the water and ash soaking into my clothes. I threw my arms around his neck, burying my face in his damp, thick hair. His skin was freezing from the storm, but his hold on me was an unbreakable, desperate vice. "You are safe," he rasped, his deep voice rough and vibrating with raw, unfiltered emotion. He pressed his lips fiercely against my collarbone, tightening his grip. "It is finished, Mila. No one will ever look at you with a threat in their eyes again." I held him tighter, pressing my cheek against his wet, scarred shoulder. The King of Seoul had just eradicated his greatest enemy to protect his crown. But sitting on the cold steel floor, I was just holding my husband. The crisp winter air of Seoul carried the faint scent of blooming plum blossoms. I walked slowly along the manicured stone pathways of the estate's sprawling private gardens, my hands tucked into the pockets of an elegant cashmere coat. 3 months had passed since the island. 3 months since the king of the underworld burned an entire empire to ash just to keep me safe. The sprawling grounds were still heavily monitored, but the shadows no longer felt like threats. Taejin trailed a respectful 10 paces behind me, fully recovered from his injuries, his stoic loyalty now fiercely absolute. As I approached the central pavilion, the elite perimeter guards didn't just stand at attention. They bowed deeply, their eyes respectfully lowered to the pavement. They weren't just guarding their boss's wife. They were acknowledging their queen. I stopped at the edge of the serene koi pond. The massive, flawless diamond on my left hand caught the bright afternoon sun, casting fractured light across the water. I felt the familiar, radiating warmth a fraction of a second before his arms actually banded around my waist. Jung-Ho pulled my back flush against his solid, muscular chest, his long fingers securely overlapping over my stomach, stepping closer until there was absolutely no space left between us. I realized I had no interest in negotiating territory when my entire world was walking in the garden. I smiled, sliding my hands up the lapels of his expensive jacket to rest flat against his chest, feeling the steady, calming rhythm of his heart. I am never alone, Jung-Ho. That familiar, heart-stopping smirk appeared, proud and fiercely protective. He lowered his head, his lips hovering mere millimeters from mine. "No," he agreed, sealing his promise against my mouth. "You never will be."